Okay, hit it.
Ever since Barry from the Iraq Veteran channel introduced us to wax slugs and cut shells, viewers have been suggesting to us to try to make them better by using Elmer's glue, super glue, hot glue, epoxies, JB weld, etc. And a lot of people have suggested trying concrete. I sifted all the large rocks out of this fence post concrete and then added lead shot to it. Without the lead shot, these would be very light. They wouldn't fly very well through the air, and they wouldn't carry very much energy. But they would also be very weak because we didn't have that aggregate structure inside the shell. And I'll explain that in more detail later on in the video. I couldn't just pour this concrete mixture into the 12 gauge shell because the moisture would foul out the powder. I used the holes from 16 and 20 gauge shells as kind of a mold and a barrel protector. And then once fully cured, I loaded them into shells backwards. The intense force of the shotgun blast is pushing on the strongest point of the slug, which is the nose, where the aggregate is. Now once the slug is out of the barrel and flying through the air, after 10 or 20 yards it'll actually flip around, very similar to how a badminton birdie works. Now these slugs are kind of a hybrid between a cut shell and a wax composite slug.
Cement slugs.
Concrete.
Concrete slugs.
Concrete galoshes.
In our first test, we shot at a target at 50 yards. This is kind of a viability test to see if the slugs would even work at all. 50 yards, the slug should have plenty of time to do what it's going to do. Whether it's going to flip around or not, we'll see. So let's see how it does.
Here you go. I got an easier way to open it up.
Definitely not the most precise slug we've ever shot, but the concept is working. After just a short while, the slug flips around and begins flying straight through the air. A little bit of waggle as it's decelerating, probably going subsonic at this point, and then finally it stabilizes quite well by the time it hits that 50-yard mark.
Cement slugs against AR 500 steel plating. See what happens.
I wouldn't want to be hit by that.
No, it's like ridged.
Why is there glitter all over it?
Now we fired the slug that I'm holding here, and it has almost no empty cavity in that 20 gauge shell, so it's not going to act very much like the first shot. And despite not having that drag stabilization, the slug actually performed very well and was quite accurate, even though it was tumbling around in the air. Now you would think that trying to make the slug fly straight through the air rather than tumble through the air would be better, but when you have a short, dense, stubby slug like this, just the inertia itself will drive it straight through the air. And adding the drag stabilization just ends up complicating it and screwing things up. And now we'll shoot at a 2x6 and see what kind of damage these things will do to a piece of wood.
Wow.
Now this slug was pretty much a clone to the first one we shot, but because we're only shooting at about 20 yards or less, it really didn't have time to fully stabilize. It's still hunting and bouncing around in its shock wave. So it was somewhat accurate. It just didn't have time to fully stabilize like we saw in that 50-yard shot. The next target are some concrete bricks. Concrete on concrete.
There you go.
Now you'll notice that the camera is moving around. It's on a tripod, but it was that windy that day. Now in this shot we had a little better results. The slug actually hit the brick nose first. It stabilized in that short 20 yards or so. Now we're kind of seeing different results with each shot, and that's not a very good thing. You want consistency with stuff like this. But as you can see in all the shots, when the slug hits something, it just disintegrates and shatters. It's just like a wax slug, more or less. And really, if you want something stronger than that, you better just use a solid lead slug. And this is the 20 gauge hole that was almost turned inside out. Now books are always fun to shoot, but they make a big mess. This book is about 1 inch thick. This book was destined for the garage sale. It was at least 10 years old and the information in it was pretty much invalid. Many people will get really upset when we shoot books like they have value, but this probably wouldn't even fetch 25 cents at a garage sale. But you can see that the slug keyholed or flew sideways through this book, but it had no problem just completely tearing it up. And of course in the high-speed shots we can see that the slug is still trying to stabilize itself, and when it finally hit the book it was flying more or less sideways. Now instead of just shooting at a paper target or something like that, we wanted to present several different medium or targets that we were shooting at, just to give you an idea of the power of these particular slugs. And then finally we have our ballistic gummy bears made out of ballistic gel. There's only 2 of them. The other ones are out of commission at this time.
I'd say that one worked.
Now when these landed on the ground, of course they became covered with sand, but you can still see where he hit the thing right in the face. And then the slug continued on, going right through the second bear as well. All in all, the performance of these slugs were mediocre. The accuracy wasn't stellar. The damage was very similar to just a wax slug. And all in all, they were just so much more labor intensive just to create. And if that's not bad enough, it took about 30 days for that concrete to fully cure. And it took us even longer before we got around to even shooting them. And about half the slugs that we shot actually failed. They actually broke apart and turned to dust when we shot them. Really, the only downside with a wax slug is if you set it out in the sun, they melt. But you can get around that by just keeping them in an ice chest until you're ready to shoot them. But let me explain why something like wax holds together while something like concrete doesn't. Now when we pour lead shot into some kind of container, we'll call this the shot cup, the balls of course will settle to the bottom and they kind of try to arrange themselves in a neat pattern. And mind you, this is without any glues or goops or cement or hot glue or whatever. We have a lot of gaps in there and the stack just isn't quite orderly. If we agitate a little bit, it will naturally rearrange these balls in a much more organized array. The glue that you use has very little to do with the strength of these. It's this uniform array that gives the slugs their ability to withstand a barrel pressure of 11,000 plus psi and an acceleration from 0 to over 850 miles per hour by the time it leaves the barrel. Now if we show the contact points between the balls, we can really see how the force is distributed evenly amongst all the balls. And this is why something as weak as wax can hold this matrix together without shattering or falling apart. Using smaller shot actually creates a stronger slug. You have many more contact points and much more surface area for them to bind together. Now if you use something like hot glue that's really thick and goopy, you're not going to be able to get the lead shot to stack in there uniformly. And you'll end up with voids, air pockets, and all kinds of other things that can throw off the balance, but most importantly, it makes the structure much weaker. I like using wax because A, it's cheap, B, it's easy to work with, and it doesn't give off fumes and stink up the place. And because wax is so thin when it's melted, it's very watery, you can create that strong matrix with just a little bit of agitation. So remember, it's not the binder, it's the structure that makes these composite or wax slugs strong. We actually had a very high failure ratio with the concrete slugs. Now you'd think that concrete would be a heck of a lot stronger than using wax, right? But because concrete's pretty thick and pretty goopy to work with, we couldn't get that real neat stacking that we could get with something thin like wax. So we actually ended up with something far inferior than using something as humble as wax to hold the shot together. Uniformity is essential to keep the slug together, but it also creates a very balanced slug, and balance equates to accuracy. If you have a slug that has voids in it, it's not going to be balanced, and you're not going to hit anything you're aiming at.
Nice.
For being a homemade projectile, a wax slug can be very accurate. You can be the best shot in the world, but if the slug doesn't fly in a predictable, true manner, you're never going to hit anything you're aiming at anyway. And it's certainly a heck of a lot more fun when you can hit what you're aiming at. Hopefully you're still here and you're still paying attention. I just want to remind you that you should check out my friends at C&Rsenal. They just did a video on this massive anti-tank gun called the T-Gewehr. I've never seen a channel work so hard to create such accurate historical content. The video quality is fantastic, great photography, animations, and then they take the guns out, actually shoot them all, and even the microphone setup they use is so complex and captures the sound so well. They just don't skip a beat at all. In many ways, C&Rsenal reminds me of a Ken Burns documentary, only it's better. They aren't pretentious, they retain their sense of humor, and the videos are very enjoyable to watch. I hope you'll check them out if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.